Hello and welcome, dear guests and panelists, organizers and online viewers watching this streaming live across the Nordic countries and all other lovers of nature and food. I'm happy to see you all here today. It's a compact event on a huge topic, and it's an honor for me to participate here today. My name is Guðrún Sóley. I work as a news reporter, and I'm also an author of a cookbook. So I'm very interested and passionate, actually, about food and nutrition in general. Like I say, it's a huge topic. We call this Seeds for the Future. How and what do we cultivate in a changing climate? And I think this is, in fact, one of the most important discussions that we can have at this point in time. During crises, I think we all maybe become more aware of basic needs, of what we need most, and we shift our focus and maybe our priorities on what we need the most, which is food, water, air, and shelter. And nature provides this perfectly to us. But somehow we manage to pose a risk to these beautiful resources. And now it's time to rethink and maybe rewind to a reliable, respectful, and sustainable approach to nutrition and nature. And that's exactly what we'll be doing here for the next 40 minutes. We could do it for 10, 12, 14 hours, but like I say, we're going to keep it short and compact today. So I suggest we all listen carefully to the good people taking places on stage today. To set the mood and inspire us, Mikael Lundkjær, plant senior scientist at the Nordic Genetic Resource Center, Nordgen, will start off with a short talk. For those unfamiliar, Nordgen is a joint gene bank and knowledge center for genetic resources in the Nordic countries. Their goal is to ensure sustainable use of genetic resources in the Nordic countries. It's a huge task, which they've tackled admirably. So I'm sure we'll learn a lot from their solutions and results. Let's welcome Mikael to the stage.
Thank you very much. So, I was asked to give a short introduction to this subject, and I already will give my opinion, and that is that genetic resources, they really hold the answers to what we are discussing. This one. Okay, it should work now, I'm told. Yes, it is. You already nicely introduced Nordic Genetic Resource Centers, and we are an institution under the Nordic Council of Ministers, and it means that we are actually also the resource center also for Iceland in this sense. I will not go into more about Nordgen. We have a stand in the tent, so you can come and meet us after this discussion, and we will tell much more about Nordgen and what we do out there. But I would like to start with what is genetic resources when we talk about genetic resources. Basically, genetic resources is the value of the genes that determines the traits that are important for us to produce future food in this context here. It could be color, it could be shape, it could be nutrition values, it could be quality, it could be yield, and it also the ability to resist diseases and pests and be able to grow in different environments. So genetic resources should also be looked at as a resource which we can utilize, and we should utilize genetic resources. They are the point that will give us resilience against climate change. It is basically the research infrastructure for plant breeding, so the basic material for the plant breeders to produce the new crops. That is the genetic resources. It also steps into the plant-based food agenda, and is adding to our self-sufficiency. Which, and the last things I actually say here is with the local grown food, it's also important that we do have things which can grow in different places. So when we have cold or warm environments, dry environments, and we can grow it, and it's important that we can have things which originated from the place which we can grow. I will talk about some project which we have done at Norgine. Norgine is, as I said, a gene bank. We have 33,000 different accession, we call them. This is, it could be a cultivar of a different species, and these 33,000 types of seeds, they represent 500 different species of plants, which is useful for food. So in a project, we took out, we looked at the 2,000 different types of peas which we had. We selected 50 peas which were as genetic diverse as we could evaluate them on color, shapes, and so on. And were selected for a project to see how far north we could grow these peas. We selected land races and old cultivars. It means that it was material which was being used before a plant has been adopted to modern agriculture. So it's like old material. We choose 4 locations. We go from the south of the Nordic area all the way up to Tromsø, which is very far north. And 2 of the stations, Tromsø and Umeå, is very much like what we are here in Iceland, in the same latitude. We measured a lot of different traits, which is important for growing and using peas as a food crop. And this is just a picture to show nicely in Tromsø how the pea field was looking. And the things which came out of this very compressed is that in all places, also even north of the Arctic Circle, the peas, they flowered eventually, and within time too you could do a harvest. Also very interesting is that if you look at days to flowering, the peas, they flowered at the same time in Denmark and in Umeå. And even though there is a huge difference in temperature and other conditions, it basically shows the effect of the long days, which are very unique for the northern part of the region, and you need plants that are adapted to that. So basically the outcome of this is that sugar peas, they have the potential to become a crop, also in the very far north. Another thing which we have done this year at Norgine is that we have an oat collection, about 1,000 lines we sow 750 of these, again, old cultivars, land races, out in the field to evaluate them. This is only at one location in the southern part, but if you just look at the picture, you can see there is difference in shapes, and the green ones meaning they are later than the other ones. There was also some which were very early. And I will bet that if we took this set of diversity in oats, planted it throughout the Nordic region, we will see things that is actually growing quite well, even in the northern part. So I'll just end this very short introduction with some statements. Again, genetic resources is very important to solve this about do cropping in the north. And in order to do this, we need to promote the use of this. We need to promote research, and not just basic research, but also simple characterization and evaluation in different places where we try out the genetic resources which are kept in gene banks like Norgine. We also, as I said, we have a specific climate in the Nordic area. We have these long days, and often plant breeding is done very in the southern part of Central Europe, or maybe in the southern part of this region, and it does not necessarily giving the traits which is important for growing crops in the north. And because it's so niche, it's also something that is needed to have public financial support. It's not something which we can do as an organization or at the universities or the breeders without financial support from the public. And then we should be aware that
utilize and make new crops, it definitely takes time. So if we want to prepare to climate change, different growing conditions, we need to start now just to keep up the pace with what we have coming. So thank you very much.
Thank you for this, Michael. I told you he'd be inspirational and interesting. We'll take all of this knowledge and put it straight to work in discussion with more experts in this field, which I'll introduce our panelists today. Daði Már Kristoffersson is Professor of Environmental and Natural Resource Economics at the University of Iceland and former Vice Rector of the Agricultural University of Iceland. Welcome, Daði Már. Then we have Dr. Hrönn Ólína Jörundsdóttir. She's the Director General for the Icelandic Food and Veterinary Authority, MAST. Welcome, Hrönn Ólína. And then we have Nicholas Ian Robinson. He's a vegetable farmer and owner of Flight Song Farm here in Iceland and a PhD candidate in geography at the University of California. He specializes in agriculture and food system. He is also a primary investigator in the research project Iceland's Horticultural Geography. Managed to say that correctly, I hope. So you see, these are true green vegetable specialists, and I think we're going to have a really forward-thinking discussion here today. I'm going to ask you for a small favor, if you'd introduce yourself for just 1 to 2 minutes, yourselves in this context, and your main projects in the field. We'll start with you, Nick.
Sure. So I think maybe the easiest way for me to talk about what I do is sort of give an idea of the chronology of how I've come to live in Iceland and work here. I originally came here first in 2011, pursuing a relationship with my wife, who's Icelandic. And at the time, I was actually just starting to really become interested in agriculture as a way to kind of interact with the natural world and to try to do something that could maybe affect ecologies and ecosystems positively through some sort of productivity. So when I came here and started living here, one of the first things that I personally noticed was that a lot of the types of vegetables and the diversity of vegetables and also the tastes in the vegetables that I was used to living in California, where I'm from, they were largely absent, and it was very difficult to find all of this when I was first living here. And that started kind of motivating me to begin to grow food on the land of my family in the south of Iceland, and start to see what could potentially grow here at these high latitudes in difficult climate. I found very quickly, at least on our land in the south, that I was able to grow almost anything, and I began to just do just that. And over the next several years, really became interested in trying to do agriculture on a production level, on a commercial scale, and started to develop the farm. And what I eventually began to understand was that a lot of the what I was perceiving as sort of a lack in the diversity and availability of various vegetables was not really necessarily due to problems with production, physical barriers, but rather probably various economic and political and regulatory structures, which essentially were preventing the development of this industry. And so I began to become very interested in that research aspect of it. And that's when I went into doing this PhD work with the University of California in Davis, and have since returned over the last few years to conduct the dissertation field work which is now mostly consists of interviewing and surveying the horticultural farmers in Iceland. So alongside our commercial scale vegetable operation, which we're growing several dozen different types of vegetables, several varieties of each for direct sale to families and restaurants, and sort of basically doing data collection on all of that. We're also interviewing and surveying horticultural farmers here in Iceland to get at some of these deeper questions as to how we can grow more vegetables and eat more vegetables in Iceland for more of the year. So that's what I'm thinking about.
There we go. Hrönn Ólína.
Thank you very much, and I'm honored to be here, and thank you for allowing me this opportunity to talk here. I'm the Director General for the Food and Veterinary Authority, so my history is not as exciting as yours, I apologize. But my background is in environmental chemistry, and I have a PhD in pollutants and how pollutants are migrating through the food chain, effect of pollutants on humans and on animals. And then further, in my last position, I was working with risk assessment, food safety, analysis of pollutants in food, etc. And today I'm representing the authority that is the Risk Management Authority. So my interest is basically how can we combine regulations with innovation, and because these are commonly opposite poles, how can we have innovation to thrive in a regulatory world? Because regulations often take time, they need a lot of data to be changed. So that is basically my interest in this topic. So thank you.
Exactly. And Daði Már.
Yes, thank you for the opportunity to be here. My background, although I am an economist, is actually agronomy. So I originally studied agronomy at Agriculture University of Iceland, where I later became vice rector, as mentioned earlier. My background, first and foremost, is on the policy side of things, so somewhat like Hrönn. And actually, as mentioned here before, I think some of the limits to a quicker development of Icelandic agriculture has actually been a relatively old-fashioned agricultural policy. So some of it, I think, are problems that we ourselves could choose to solve if we wanted to. But it is, of course, difficult and has been challenging because funding is limited. If you change agricultural policy, well, someone will lose out. However, we, I think, today stand in front of challenges that require us to rethink things. So I welcome this opportunity to have this discussion.
Thank you. And let's start the discussion, shall we? I wanted to ask Nick, I think it's really interesting that you mentioned that the harsh nature of Icelandic environment was not the prime limitation in your vegetable growing. You've been growing vegetables in this country in those harsh, limited conditions for a long while now, but they were the governmental, regulatory limits. What were those primarily? What limitations did you come across the most?
Well, one thing that is easiest to talk about, and a lot of people are actually familiar with the situation. But for example, our farm, our production methods involve no usage of any pesticides, no herbicides at all, no sprays of any kind. We do not use any synthetic fertilizers of any type. So this is what most people would understand to be organic agriculture, and yet we are not certified organic. And if you speak with a lot of small farmers, in different countries throughout Europe or in the United States, as well as here in Iceland, that are growing in this way, you'll find that in fact there are quite a few farmers that are not certified organic, yet utilize these production practices. So this is one obvious disconnect, and there are multiple reasons, why this is, but a lot of it has to do with the fertility regimen that we utilize. So we utilize compost as our primary source of fertility, and at least in Europe, compost cannot be certified as organic if there are particular components in the compost, the original components to the compost that are not organically certified themselves. And so that chain goes very, very far back. And of course, when these regulatory structures are being discussed and mulled over and then finally codified and all of this, there's, after a while, there's quite a disconnect to the actual local circumstances in which some of these these regulatory structures are trying to govern. And so, especially being on an Arctic island, quite far away from anything else, where we have to figure out what to do with our materials and turn various materials and fertility sources into vegetables. If we don't want to use imported fertilizers, for example, we have to kind of use what we have on the island. And if you combine that with, the way that compost is made, especially in our region in the south, with various manures of animals which cannot be certified organic, then you have a product which cannot be certified organic, and thus my vegetables cannot be certified organic. So that's one good example, of a disconnect, I think, between good regulatory structures with good intentions, not really meeting local conditions.
Mm-hmm. And complexities as well, I guess. Mikael, I'm interested in the research that you do at Nordgen. You advance research in this field and try to find out which crops and which particular types of vegetables and fruits and whatnot can be grown in the Scandinavian context and nature. And I'm interested to know maybe how we push these boundaries. What are the most promising types of food and maybe therein vegetables that we can grow in the Nordic countries to try to promote sustainability in local produce?
The thing is that the Gene Bank is operating as a place where we conserve the genetic resources, and we try to increase the knowledge about this by particular projects together with plant breeders and universities. But our material is basically conserved and wait for other people to utilize. We do not have the financial money to actually go out and do this. But what we have should be looked at as a big treasure, and there is a lot of potential things to find in what we have. And in the vegetable collection, we have a lot of the vegetables which have been grown in the Nordic area, all over the Nordic area, and we have material which has been made before more modern breeding, meaning that it has traits which have disappeared. And again, we do not exactly know what they have, but every time we looked or somebody else looked into it, they found new things which can be used. So basically, we cannot say that we have a particular very good vegetables which you can grow in a particular place, but we have the basis for finding it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Promising nonetheless.
Yes.
Hrönn, I'm wondering, here in Iceland, I think members of the public want to eat responsibly. We, in general, want to be responsible human beings, trying to manipulate or control our consumption into a responsible direction, generally. But we lack maybe information or guidance in that regard. What guidance do you think it's advisable for government and official organizations to give public of how they should eat in the most responsible manner, or how to have the least possible environmental impact? Isn't that guidance important, and how do we sort of do that and create that policy?
Yeah, I agree. I think this message is very important because information is vital for the regular consumer to make these choices. How we make them available and what do we make available is, of course, the question. And I think also the problem is trying to solve environmental issues. People often ask for a quick solution. My experience in working with environmental research for 20 plus years is that if you want to, if you're asking for a quick solution, you're only moving the problem to another field. So to disseminate this information to the public is actually challenging because the solution, I think, is quite, not easy, but it's boring. And it's basically eat local, use environmentally friendly products, etc. But it's, yeah, I think the challenge is actually making this exciting and, yeah, holistic. Because I also experience that people like to identify themselves on the outskirts of the general public. For example, we have a lot of trends. We have keto, we have vegans, we have, yeah, to continue. But I think we have to start to look into everything holistically. Because we have nutrition, we have plastic, we have fertilizers, we have pesticides, we have combustions and global warming and everything. And we can't give one suggestion to fix everything. So it's sort of these old suggestions, just eat healthy, eat local. But I think it's difficult to make this message interesting and exciting. I think that's the challenge.
On that note, I'm curious, when you mention eating locally, that's something that is very much reliant upon each country's governmental policy in context of nutrition. So the government makes decisions on what is grown locally and made, produced locally, and in that regard controls what people who eat locally eat. And isn't that a responsibility of general authorities, what is grown and produced and facilitated locally?
I agree, and like Dadi was saying, I think we have an old-fashioned policy in agriculture in general. And there are different challenges in changing this policy. There are interests on different sides of producers and consumers. So trying to draft or publish a policy that grasps the overarching benefit of environment and public health that might actually result in that one group is losing something while another group is gaining something. So I think it's politics, and politics is never simple. But I would also like to continue. I'm really glad that the current Ministry of Food and Agriculture and Fisheries is actually trying to set some sort of a policy, and that's a work that is ongoing, and I'm really looking forward that she is going to publish a food policy this autumn. So at least that's a start point, and where we go from there is then just future politics.
Exactly. Like someone said, food is the most political thing you can talk about or mention. Daði, you co-authored a report last year about food safety in Iceland. Like I mentioned before.
Food security.
Food security, exactly. Like I mentioned, our basic needs, air, food, water, shelter, and it should be maybe one of the most basic things, but is something that we constantly have to reconsider and keep fresh. Could you tell us maybe in a few words what were your maybe main points out of that work?
Well, actually, Nick already mentioned some of it that's kind of obvious, and that is that if you go to a local Icelandic store, you'll find that a very large share of our food is imported. Partly it has to do with growing conditions in Iceland, and is understandable and probably not going to change. Iceland is on the extreme end of what we might call globalization of food markets. If you look at a map of food security, Iceland is one of the biggest food exporters in the world. So we are, in kind of the simplest caloric terms, one of the most food secure nations on earth. However, this food is very homogeneous. It's all fish. We could eat as much as 15 kilograms per person per day from our resources. Who wants that? Well, that's something you could argue. On the other hand, most everything else we import, with the exception of meat and some of our vegetables. Now, what the report shows is that even those industries with food security is a complicated issue, even the locally produced food depends on imported inputs. So that's a situation everyone experiences: importation of chemical fertilizer, oil for machines, machinery itself, so forth and so on. But our ability to increase production, especially plant production, is very substantial. And I don't think people mind much or think about the development of food production in the world, but it's good to think about the fact that tomorrow there will be 200,000 more people on Earth to feed, and again the day after that, and again the day after that. This is the development throughout the middle of this century. Most of the good agricultural land in the world is already being used. We see food prices have been increasing from the turn of this century, are probably going to continue. We see political instability affecting this very dramatically, like the war in Ukraine. So food security in terms of, you might say, global responsibility and in terms of local stability matters enormously. And what Iceland has in abundance is energy, actually clean, renewable energy. Water, we are, I think, the water richest country in the world. And land in Iceland is cheap, although it's unproductive. So I'm sure Nick can verify that if he was growing in California, if he had the same size of land, he probably wouldn't have to work. He could just live off the rents. That's not the fact in Iceland. In that lies an enormous opportunity. But like Hrönn said, and actually Nick also mentioned, the problem has been that traditionally we think the production capacity is limited. It really is not. It's our imagination that has, or history that stops us from grabbing these opportunities.
Exactly. Mikael, I'm curious, in your experience, you have a lot of experience in this field and in this conversation in general. Technical limitations are one thing, but I am interested in the culture, shifting of our attitudes toward our food, because that's something that seems to change slowly. We have an emotional connection to what we eat and how we go about our meals, which are just a big cultural affairs and moments in our lives, really. What, in your opinion, are the most maybe or best ways to try to shift people's attitude towards food into a more sustainable, responsible direction?
I think that there are, in most places, there are a disconnection between where the food is, how the food is being produced, and how you get the food. And I think that it's very important that we already from a young age start to increase the knowledge about where does the food come from, how do we grow the foods, what is the possibilities, and in that way get a knowledge built up about the food production. Then there's the whole thing about this local food production, which in many places also is a way to connect people. So you have if you go a couple of generations back, you would have probably have some tradition or history for what you're growing and knowledge about this is disappearing, but you could maybe reintroduce this by having local production. It could be protein crops which you can eat directly. It could be vegetables on farms where there is very short distance between where they are produced and what you can and when you and how to get them. But I also think that the diversity in which we of different types of vegetables and things which we eat have increased a lot. There has been all this focus about Nordic food and also what we have in surrounding and so on. And I think it is important to make this visible for people so they can make a choice. And often they will then will choose the local produced stuff because they know the history.
Mm-hmm. We're running out of time, unfortunately, so I'm going to give you a task to finish off. We've been talking quite generally about the problem at hand, although I don't think it's maybe advisable to think of it as a problem, but a challenge. It's a pressing matter. Something has to be done immediately. We have to take big steps forward in this context. Like Daði mentioned, we are growing by the numbers every day, and we have to find sustainable ways to feed humankind. I'd like you to mention 3 key things, 3 emphasis points that you think are most important when talking about food for the future, respect towards nature and sustainability, this beautiful context that we've been talking within today. Just 3 single words on what you think is advisable to emphasize and underline going forward in this context. I know I'm asking a lot, but like I say, it's a pressing matter. Nick, you go first. 3 words. Go.
3 words.
Mikael is lucky. He's going to go last.
I'll say money, meaning funding for the farmers to actually pay the workers enough to do this work, and access for consumers, and
It doesn't have to be 3. 2 is enough. It's charged 2
I'll
words.
leave it there. That balance is very important.
Thank you. Hrönn.
Thank you. I would say, firstly, innovation. I think that's the key forward. I would say circular, both economy and circular nutrition, so that we look at the system circular, meaning that I think we are throwing away a lot of our nutrition just into the ocean, for example. And thirdly, I would like to say holistic policy.
Daði.
Well, I'm lucky to be third, so I got a chance to think about this. But actually, the environmental footprint of food production in the world is absolutely enormous, and it cannot be sustained. So we have an unsustainable food system in the world currently, reducing the environmental footprint first and foremost. I think, secondly, I agree with Hrönn, innovation. Innovation will help us along this way. Thirdly, we need policies that allow farmers to make up their own mind about what they produce and how they produce it, as long as it is sustainable.
Mikael.
I would say awareness at all levels. So awareness from people, awareness from the farmers, awareness from the political system, from breeders, research. And then I will say there is a lot to do in the area of targeted breeding, so breeding of dedicated crops for particular areas, and then that leads back to what is my mega key point, is that we need to use the genetic resources which we have, and we need to conserve and preserve them for the future also.
Beautiful. Almost just 3 words per person. Thank you so much for this good discussion. I hope you take this inspiration and positive outlook. You see, we've got our best people on the job. You know, we've got our most brilliant minds globally working on this issue. because it is pressing, and I hope that we all use this as an inspiration to eat responsibly and with awareness, like Mikael says. I thank you for listening, for your attention today, and goodbye. Takk så meget.